So for today's session, we're going to talk about accommodations, modifications, and specially designed instruction. And one of the things that we found is that those are things that we really need to focus on, really understanding kind of delineation between accommodations, modifications, and specially designed instruction. So for some of even our special education teachers, that's a difficult concept to understand. So we are going to spend some time today just thinking about what that looks like and talking about that. And okay. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the differences with accommodations, modifications, and specially designed instruction. So that's our focus for today. And then we're going to talk about how do we select accommodations, and then we're going to talk about specially designed instruction. So the purpose for today is not really an inclusion training, but we're really going to be talking about understanding how to determine what accommodations students need, the difference in modifications, and then how do we do the specially designed instruction? What does the instruction look like that accompanies those accommodations and modifications to support our students? And when we talk to special ed teachers, what we know is that even with our new teachers, that's something that's an area of concern for them to really be able to delineate between the two. And so what we have found is that we want to continue to support teachers. And we know that you as building leaders, and you guys are leaders over the special education departments at your schools, we wanted to make some of the same learning available to you, because it's important as you facilitate and lead ARC meetings, and you guys are chairpersons, and your oversight with both that and then the specially designed instruction at school. So
Dion, if I might interject right here, a year or so ago, we had a group of experienced special education teachers in the building here with us, and we were doing some training around some innovative education initiatives. And we asked that question. We asked that very question. What do you spend more of your time doing as a special education teacher? And definitively, the answer was that they spent the majority of their time providing accommodations. And so what we're going to talk about today is maybe that gentle shift toward a blending of accommodations and special design instruction. And as we see students grow toward independence, we're going to see that that balance is really, really important, and that we're actually growing students' skills and not just providing accommodations.
All right, thank you, Mr. May. The very first thing we want to do is at the opening activity is just give you a minute to think about what you already know about what an accommodation is, what a modification is, and then what specially designed instruction is. Take one moment to think about what you believe the definition is for each of those terms.
Hi, this is Melissa Turner at Prestonsburg Elementary. And
I'm Melissa.
as far as accommodations go, like that's just giving the child the strategies they need to be successful. And what services do we provide them so that they can be, as successful as they can as other students.
Good. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Anyone else want to share?
Dion, this isn't my normal subject area, but I would assume modifications is anything that you change to an existing lesson to try to help prepare the student, whereas special design instruction would be you designed it with that purpose to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Casey. I appreciate that. Right, so that's what we're going to really talk about, is diving into that. What's special about specially designed instruction? That's what we do special for that student. And then we'll talk about how we make those choices about accommodations, and then also a little bit of the difference about the modifications, because that one is a tough one, because what for some, we're not modifying content, but what do we modify in our instruction or modify with the delivery that makes a difference for our students. Thank you. Anybody else? So we just wanted to pause right there and let you just be thinking about what those definitions are to you now. And at the end, we're going to let you just reflect back and think about, did those things shift, or were there changes in your thinking after we had the conversation today? So I appreciate you all joining on. and participating. So here, let's talk just a little bit about accommodations and modifications. So you'll see on the screen, there's really kind of two thought bubbles that you'll think about when you're talking about accommodations and modifications for students with disabilities. We think about that from the lens of what that general instruction looks like. And we also think about what those accommodations are for state testing. So the general instruction is what we do every day, and this is how we accommodate students, because we're providing to them support. But critically important, we're providing with them access and being able to have access to content, which is very, very important. So those are things that we consider. And then we're thinking about, when we accommodate them, how can they demonstrate what their knowledge or the achievement is, and then how are we assessing them? And again, we think through both of those lenses. And sometimes that's a difficult balance for teachers to think through, particularly if they're new or they've not had a lot of experience with working in special education, or sometimes our general ed teachers maybe have not had a lot of coursework in understanding accommodations and modifications. And so this could be helpful for them too. And again, this is really intentionally for you as leaders to be able to lead those departments and just give you some resources to support that. What sometimes happens is, we give kind of some blanket supports like differentiation or universal design for learning, and we have that misconstrued with how that is individualized or different for that student. So those are always things that we help people to understand, those terms and definitions. The biggest thing about an accommodation, it is that we are still looking and guided by the standards. And so when we accommodate, we don't reduce the learning. And a lot of times, there's a little bit of a misconception about if we're doing a 5th grade reading standard and we lower that Lexile level so the kids can have access to be able to read that content. We're still teaching the skill within that standard, and an accommodation allows us to help teach that skill. And so that's what we're going to keep thinking about through that accommodations, and how those are regularly and routinely used in our regular instruction every day. And those are with the special education teacher, but those will occur in that co-teaching setting in the general education classroom as well. And then
Dion,
the other,
I'm
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, accommodations provide access to the content and levels the playing field for students. And then, you can do that with as those experiences occur naturally in the flow of instruction, and choose those accommodations to help the student get the understanding, or maybe get to the level playing field and get to the access. But when you're doing it with state testing, you are thinking more about what the assessments told me. Do I have an IP goal that's intentional that we're working with, and is it an allowable state test accommodation? And so but the other big distinction here is to not reduce the learning with an accommodation. You're allowing the student to show us what they've learned, and you're overcoming a barrier that may exist from the disability. And then with modification, it's a little bit deeper and a little bit different. Those are really directed toward our alternate assessment folk. Students that have significant intellectual disability, and there's a reduction in the breadth and depth of the standard there, but we're still hitting the learning target. So
Thank you, Ms.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just, thank you, Mr. May. I think that was important. This one is one area that we often see people get a little bit confused when we talk about modifications. So we're not modifying the standard or the standard. If we make a modification or we change the way we teach, that's a little different than the modification on the for the state testing. So that's important to remember, that we never change the standard. We never modify the standard unless it's for those students who are on the alternate assessment. And I think that's just a good note to remember.
I was just going to say a good example of that might be if when you're doing when you're looking at a test, or you're looking at a number of problems that a student is about to attempt in mathematics. And if you reduce the number, but you hit all the content standards, like if you hit addition and multiplication and division and subtraction, and you still keep that, but you reduce that from, let's say, 30 problems to 15 problems, as long as you're continuing to reinforce the standard, that's an accommodation. But if you were to take one piece of that standard away, then it would become a modification. And so those terms are sometimes used interchangeably. And we just want to clear up any kind of misconception on that. And we're sure that you guys know that, but that's something that our newer staff may not have the background knowledge and the prior experience with.
Right. And I think that's a good point. Those are just some misconceptions that you might catch as leaders. Again, you'll know, might see those if you're visiting those classrooms, as you are hearing PLC meetings when teachers are talking about the collaboration, how they're co-designing or planning lessons. So those are important things to remember. The next slide here is just when we start thinking about what our accommodations are appropriate, we start, historically in special education, there's been some approaches that we just start, we look at the disability, and based on that disability, they get certain accommodations that they're automatically attached to a certain disability. But really what we need to know and think about is we really have to understand what that child's disability is, what the impact of that disability is for that student on their educational performance, and then how does that impact their learning. And so when we make decisions about choosing accommodations for students, those are really the guiding questions that we have. And again, that's been a common error, that sometimes we give a blanket accommodations for students with particular disabilities, and that's not necessarily the case. So I wanted you all to think about that, and then we're going to look at this next slide. This one is right, a screenshot from what it looks like from an IEP, and you'll see that these are the accommodations that we select for state testing. And so when we think about what those accommodations are, those very first conversations start in those ARC meetings. And we have those ARC meetings where we're looking at eligibility, we're looking at maybe we're looking at an annual review, we're looking at a reevaluation. But the purpose of our meeting, we're always looking, when we develop a new IEP, about those accommodations. And so not to just keep always using the same ones and just doing that same ritual of just going back and using over and over the same ones. We really need a process, and special ed teachers and regular ed teachers need to be able to have understand how we derive those answers based on some evaluation. So the questions that we want to consider when we select accommodations. And so that's important to think about the questions as we are guiding that thinking during those ARC meetings, particularly. And again, this one, we're just going to work through those subsections, but what does the student need? Because we are looking for that student to be able to have, to be able to independently and have access. Again, it's all about that access to the content. What are they good at? What are some of their strengths? So maybe they have some strengths that you can use to help you make decisions whether or not they need that. Sometimes kids can read words, but their comprehension is an area. So maybe, but they're able to recall or read words. So that might be a strength. They may have some strengths in math. So there's areas we always know about those strengths. And then, but what is it that they need special in their area of concern? And then the other thing is, what are they going to do later on? I mean, maybe if you're looking at an elementary, they may not know that right now, but we're thinking about, what's their plans? What are the skills that they're going to need? For example, if you have an older student and they want to be a carpenter, right? But they're going to have to be able to do some math calculation, and they're going to have to be able to do some design. So what are they going to need in order to be able to have some mastery of those skills in mathematics? And so that's how you kind of think about and frame those questions. So we don't always just go click a calculator for an accommodations, but we really want to understand why that child needs that calculator. There's a far deeper knowledge that we would want to have about that individual student to help us make those decisions. And that's, we wanted you all to have access to these guiding questions. It helps us to think and process through those.
And then going back to what we were talking about earlier is blending and finding that balance between providing an accommodation and also continuing to instruct. And that balance may be a little more bent toward accommodation as a student gets into high school and we have less time, if they have a significant reading disability, to work on teaching them to read. But we still don't want to give up on teaching them to read and then providing that accommodation. So that looking for that balance and what's appropriate for that student at that point in time is very important.
Right. Thank you, Mr. May. And then I'm going to go ahead and click to the next slide, because I'm going to let you all just kind of think about this in just a second. So the next thing is we also want to consider the environment. What equipment and materials do they have access to? What's the physical arrangement? What are some resources or supports available to students? Now we have one-to-one devices, right? We have lots of technology. There's lots of things that we have. We also want to think about what kind of barriers might they have. Is there some limited access to technology? Is there some access to internet? Can you get to the computer lab? Do they have one-to-one devices? And now we're much more fortunate because we do have that opportunity for kids to have those devices, but those are always something we want to think about. The next one was we have to think about what the student needs to be able to do when we're thinking about the accommodations. And so here, what are some of the activities what do they have to be able to do in that learning environment? What assessments and instruction support their goals? Because we're thinking about what the student has to be able to do to demonstrate their knowledge.
One of those things might be, Dion, that you're teaching that student to access the manipulatives that they're using to apply to a mathematics problem, and you get them into that routine of using that accommodation and being able to not just giving it to them, but teaching them that, and that kind of blends in with specially designed instruction as well.
It does. That's right. Thank you. And then the fourth question is, what helps them to be successful? And we always think about what with low tech, high tech, or no tech, what resources do kids need? What particular strategies might a student need? For example, I had a student who had other health impairment, but he also had a visual spatial issue, and he qualified for occupational therapy. And so he had a difficult time transferring things from the board to his paper, for example. So how do we help him? What does he need? That's when we start thinking about, does he need a scribe? What supports does he need? Because his disability, and maybe we wouldn't always consider all of that gamut of accommodations, but when we really think about what that student needs, then that leads us to answering those questions. When we think about those accommodations and what students are going to need, there are different choices that we have when we select those accommodations, talking about an online or text reader versus a human reader. And so the other thing is, we got this conversation about, do we need an online calculator? Do we use this handheld calculator? And then if we have an enlarged calculator, a special calculator, that would be maybe for our VI kids or our hearing impaired kids. Or then when we're talking about a scribe. But the key things are talking about exactly what y'all were talking about. We're looking at each child individually, and we're thinking about how those accommodations are used routinely, and are they using those every day in the instruction? And then what arrangements do we need to make sure that those are available to students? But not only do we have to decide what accommodation is appropriate, we may have to teach them how to use that accommodation, right? If I can, and you all, I'm certain have had this experience. You think about, giving the student opportunity to work on a computer, and they can't remember their password. They can't get their headphones to work. They can't get the rate or the speed of the text reader to be correct. There are lots of pieces of instruction that goes along with those accommodations as well. So for example, giving a child a calculator is one thing, but to give them that instruction on how to use that calculator, and then they have to be able to discern how to use it and when it's appropriate. Those are all important things to consider. And, we think, they need help with math reasoning? Is it math calculation? So there are much deeper, richer conversations that can be the center of that discussion when you use that guiding tool and those reflective pieces to think about what exactly do they need and how can we support that student.
One of the things I was going to say, Dion, we had a really good discussion around the accommodations modifications form that's in Infinite Campus. And that's one of those things that, that helps newer teachers to kind of formulate. It's almost like a scaffold for them to make sure that they're deciding on appropriate accommodations, and that we have that discussion in that ARC, and that helps just kind of frame that discussion for that. And then the other thing, when we morph into talking about delivery of accommodations, I think we have to look at the student's disability. We really have to look at their needs. What are their needs specifically, and how much guided practice, how much modeling, how much removing the cognitive overload from their being do we need to do? We need to consider those things because we want these accommodations to be effective. And so we need to make sure that we're intentionally thinking about instructing students in the use of those and allowing them to practice so they've got it down so it becomes a routine. Routine is so huge for our students. Routine's huge for me, and so I just wanted to throw that in there. I was going to say that, that form is not, the accommodations form in Infinite Campus has not been a mandated form. It was in the past, and we kind of went away from it. But I think it's really relevant today with the way our staffs are constructed with lesser experienced folks, and we face that every day as administrators. How do we monitor? How do we help and make more efficiency for our teachers? And we don't want to add anything to them, but we certainly want them to be able to work through that document and get the appropriate accommodations provided and the data that supports it for the needs.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So the next piece of that, and we're going to just move on through the accommodations discussion, but the next thing that we're going to talk about is exactly what we're already having those conversations. But this is one of those things I think, again, is kind of a stumbling block for us because, we might make a decision about an accommodation, but we always have to go back and make sure we are revisiting that. Does the student, exactly what Mr. May was saying, do they regularly use that accommodation? Was the student able to participate fully in the classroom and the assessment with that accommodation? So again, remember, we're talking about giving them access. Was the student able to master those objectives? So if you answer yes, then that accommodation is effective. But if the answer is no, then we need as a team to go back and say, what did we choose the right accommodation? Do we need a different approach? Is there another support that the students might need? And so rather than, we don't want to just always assume that those are the correct accommodations, because again, it goes back to those questions, and that comes right from that guidance from the Kentucky Department of Education. We have to monitor and evaluate if those accommodations are appropriate. And throughout the year, we're using those accommodations in that classroom, right? In that general instruction, we're using those accommodations. So we want to do some checks on that. Are they working? How's the student performing? We could look at assessments. We could look at formal and informal data on how students are doing. We could look at assessments on if they have accommodations versus no accommodations on some of your tests. I know some districts do that a little differently, but we have some data along the way to tell us if those accommodations are being effective and what student supports, because they may just need a little extra support or help. But this piece sometimes kind of gets overlooked or skipped because we mark those, but that's really part of that whole cyclical process, just making sure that we're doing and supporting students what they need rather than just visiting that annually. We just want to keep a check on that and see how it's going for them.
And when we strive toward independence, we're going to do that with a combination of well-rounded, well-developed, well-planned, specially designed instruction, and a blend of accommodation to put those two things together. and to build that student. And, there's some language in the law that said we should be fading those accommodations to independence. And so as we continue to perfect this, we need to think about that. The other thing I wanted to say too, Ms. Bates, is that certainly we as principals, we are always concerned with how our schools are performing, not only in the classrooms and that's what makes things happen on those state tests, but how we're doing on those state tests. And so as we're monitoring and evaluating how we're providing these accommodations and if they're being effective, we also need to think about, in the test, during the testing window, who is doing the accommodating for our students? Are we thinking through that upside down lens of, considering our special needs students first, and that, I know our schools are starting to flip that grid and starting to think about planning for students with differences first. And as we do the co-teaching models and things of that nature, but we want to think about how closely does the situation in the classroom get reconstructed in the testing situation? I think sometimes where we fall off the page and we look and we say, well, why did this kid had these high level accommodations? We know he was doing well in the classroom, and then he goes to the test and the test score maybe comes back less than what we had expected or anticipated or hoped. And so we got to think about who, are we equipped and are we putting the right people with the right people? And so I think that's a key consideration for a principal. And if if you're doing walkthroughs and if you're doing PLCs around these things, those are certainly things to consider.
There is the IEP and Lesson Plan Development Handbook. And that resource, I've got it linked on this page, but I'm going to let you just take a second, and in your participant guide, you will see that there's the resources. It's kind of highlighted in green. It's a tool that the Kentucky Department of Education has used for a very long time, and it helps teachers. And I wanted you all to have this resource, or we did, because it's a resource as teachers are thinking about. They may not be familiar with this, especially because we have a lot of new teachers, but it helps them to think about what specially designed instruction is, because we're getting ready to shift now into talking about specially designed instruction. And I just wanted to kind of prep everybody and give you just a second to find that resource, because now we talked about accommodations, and we're going to shift and think about the accommodations, give them access, and they support their learning. But now a critical piece is the instruction. And so some of the things, and I'll help you all just kind of think about it in this context. In our service area, we have 20 schools that were TSI or CSI. And of those 20 schools, 15 of the schools were in TSI or CSI because of disability. And then the others were in for the overall. And what we know is our students with disabilities, we maybe are accommodating and providing those supports for them, but then there's another step, and that is that instruction, the teaching and learning that happens routinely in the classroom. And that is special because it's special for that student. So we talk about what, differentiation, universal design and learning for what we do in that core instruction, but this is a layer on top of that that's special for that individual student. And we wanted to make sure you all had this resource, because again, as leaders, you want to have those resources and tools and links that you can share with teachers, particularly if you see, you're in those discussions in ARC meetings and you want to be able to reference those, or in those PLC meetings as those new teachers are building their toolbox and their repertoire of resources, and then you all have this. But that particular resource gives you, and I'll just click that for a second, and hopefully that takes us to the right spot. But the IEP handbook, and I'm just going to scroll down just to the table of contents, just so you all can see. It talks about what specially designed instruction is, and then it talks about all the supports they need, and then it goes into depth about the definitions of those and what those mean. And then it moves into implementation and lesson planning. And again, it's just a resource for you to have. And so let's just start talking about the definition. And specially designed instruction is instruction that is tailored to a particular student. we're talking about that specially designed instruction. And so what specially designed instruction, again, is that it's very tailored to that individual student. It's special for that student. So it's not a blanket. We do this for every kid. It's not one that we just choose in a drop down menu as, we do this same thing for every kid, but we want to really intentionally think about what that individual student needs and then how do we support that. And so we'll talk a little bit about that adapting the content. And so sometimes we adapt the content, right? So we might use a lower lexile reading. We might use a high interest, low readability text. We may use a paired text that we've used as a resource that has, again, that lower level. But we're never reducing the standard, right? Because we're using text to teach a skill or a strategy, and we're not reducing the standard. But what is it that we need to adapt for students through those texts, through maybe we have to change the order of the way things are delivered. Maybe we have, we as special education teachers or teachers delivering specially designed instruction, maybe we learn to only teach that critical content and we don't teach all of those extra things. And I always give this example of my own error that I made in my classroom is I used to teach that story of the Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. And so we used that text and we enjoyed that text and we loved that text, but that was a lot of embellished and fun things that went along with that activity. But there were some things that were critical, the skills that I was trying to teach, like characterization or how the character changes over a course of a text. That was the critical piece. So spending a lot of time on that text without focusing on that specific skill takes a lot of time, but then you're not really getting to the meat of that skill. And sometimes that's what teachers need help with, is to be able to know how to find that very discrete skill that kids need and be able to focus on that. And that's what we're talking about for the adapting the content. There's a lot of things kids can know and learn and you can teach, but what is that most important thing that they need to know from that lesson? And that, again, that's helping us to adapt that content we can take some of that other stuff away. We may have to build a little bit of background knowledge, right? We may have to add a little content. That means we may have to build their knowledge. So we may have to pre-teach something, or we may have to do some, maybe use some images or pictures to give them an example of a construct of what something looks like. But the thing we want to remember, and that's hard for teachers to think about, is we don't want to lower the standard. We don't want to lower what that expectation is. We change the way we teach that. And that's a hard one to remember, because it's easy to always go back and give them lower lexile level, but we got to know what the skill or strategy we're teaching. And we got to keep that in mind, right? Okay, to be able to move students. And that rate of growth may be much different than a general ed student, right? The rate of growth may be significantly slower, and our pacing may be significantly slower, but we want to remember that. And then the way we teach our methods, it might be a little different. We might use chunking, right? And we always talk about chunking, but what we mean is we really may need to break that down in. If we have kids who have an intellectual disability or a cognitive, they can't remember, they have working memory, we may have to break that down to one step at a time. We may have to break down building a 5-paragraph model, writing a 5-paragraph essay, to writing a paragraph, or maybe the first thing we have to do is learn how to write a thesis statement or an introductory. And so that's what becomes that special, is that we break that down based on that unique need of that child to help them understand. We might use some multisensory approaches, and sometimes that's difficult to integrate or know how to integrate that, but how important it is for our students that are struggling, our students with disabilities, is to use those manipulatives and to use letter tiles or algebra tiles or unifix cubes or bead strings or those things, sound tubs, because that's what our kids need, and they need many, many more turns, practice turns, and feedback, right? So our students that are struggling need more and more turns. And so that's another thing we want to think about is, there might be ways that we have to build in time for those opportunities for practice turns and feedback. So those are things that we also want teachers to think about when they're thinking about choosing what we do special, and then how do we do that delivery? And that could be unique based on the student's disability. That could be, and thinking about how we're getting them access to that general curriculum. And so, that goes back to that same thing. When we teach them, we model, we teach, we let them practice along with us. Maybe we have to model some more. We give them some more practice. And that's where we really use that explicit instruction model, that I do, we do, you do. But that's part of how we're delivering our teaching. And we might have to have a mnemonic. We might have to have a picture. Kids might need to see an image. And so those are additional things that we would do that's special for that student, because maybe we know and understand their learning style is different. And so because we know that student so well, we can make decisions about how we teach them and the supports that we give them because of that. And so that's what we're talking about, that specially designed instruction. It's a much richer and deeper conversation than just explicit instruction or just direct instruction or using mnemonics. It's really about understanding that connection between what that child's disability is, how we accommodate them, and then how we teach them.
And Dion, I was going to say too that I can envision planning sessions, PLCs, where we're working with newer staff and we're just saying, hey, we got to look at the standard, let the standard guide us. And when we know what the data tells us and what the student needs, we can develop that goal, that special education IEP goal that's measurable, that we can get data from. But also then say, here's the content, here's how the general education teacher is going to do it. What are you going to do different and special? What are you going to do that's intentional toward that goal? And what are you going to do to adapt that content so that it's manageable for our students based on their disability? And what kind of scaffolds, what kind of accommodations do we have to provide? So it's questions that we ask. So we would take just a simple one standard and deconstruct that standard and come up with the strategies that we're going to use to attack that standard differently for our students that have these barriers. And then we would and just practice that through, if you take it through the Anita Archer model, the I do it, we do it, you do it model that I love so much. You can model it for them in those early PLCs, and then you could have them to start gradually releasing that and have them model it back for you. It's so that they really get to understand that specially designed instruction is really special. It's really something more than universal design for learning that we do up front, or it's more than differentiated strategies that we plan for differences and readiness and those types of things that Carol Ann Tomlinson has so taught us over the years. But it's just really a bit more than that. And if we could get that process and that routine down, and then I think we've got to get back to holding folks more accountable for planning. Okay, I don't know how you do that, and I'm not going to be the Debbie Downer here and say you got to make all your special ed teachers have lesson plans, but certainly I can't see that anything good's going to happen and we're going to make improvements that we need to make unless we're doing intentional planning around that content and our delivery and our strategies. And one place to look at those strategies are high leverage practices. Anita Archer is the guru of explicit instruction, high leverage practice number 16, and her hands are all over that CEC document. And so I think that's a good place to start when we start looking at how are we going to adapt this instruction, how are we going to adapt this content and this delivery that we need so desperately for our students to make advances. And it's federal law. We're supposed to be doing it, right?
Right. Good point. Good point. So I'm going to move to the next slide and we're going to talk a little bit about this. Before we do, again, that understanding the difference between specially designed instruction, differentiation, accommodation, modification, that's a real barrier for our teachers. And we want to continue to support their learning on that because they do get confused. And it's easy to make those errors when you don't have a real good understanding or you've not had a lot of coursework or opportunities for learning, particularly in the methodology or teaching too. So that's, again, something that we can help teachers with. Let's think about an example when we're talking about that content, methodology, and delivery. And so when we're talking about the content, remember we were thinking about how to get students access to that but we're not taking away the expectation for that standard. So we're looking at that standard. And let's say, we'll use an example of a kindergarten. And let's say if students are supposed to be blending and segmenting phonemes, right? And there, you could have a student that's at a higher grade level that's working at the kindergarten level. But we're talking right now about, let's just say our example would be a standard on blending and segmenting phonemes. So we would start thinking about that for that specially designed instruction. So again, that's going to be in addition to what we do for the other students. But what are we going to do? We're going to use some kind of systematic approach, right? We maybe are using some kind of systematic approach into how we teach them that how to segment or blend phonemes. And then we might use some multisensory tools, right? We might use pictures. We might have those Unifix cubes when you break this and you segment syllables. We might, or phonemes. We might use bead strings. There's lots of things that we might use that's a multisensory. We might use wiki sticks. There's all kinds of things that we can do, or images, right? To have kids break those apart and then put those phonemes back together. So when we start thinking about, we understand that that's what we want them to be able to do. We have to think about with their disability, what is it they're going to need? Are they going to need those visual supports? Are they going to need those multisensory tools? And then they're going to need them often, and we got to let them practice with them until they get that, because they need that very concrete model. The same thing in mathematics.
Miss Bates, I was thinking about, and don't mean to interrupt you here, but I was just thinking about an example of all the rules that go with how you place the sound of the letter C, the cuh sound. I was just thinking about all the rules that go with that. If it goes with a CH, or if it goes with a vowel, if it goes with, all the rules. Think about, and if you just gave all those rules to the kid and said, here's what you do here, and here's what you do here. Think about the cognitive overload that might be. And if when you look back to your psychological reports, you're going to see that students have trouble remembering. Our students in special education have trouble remembering. So we have to reduce some of that cognitive overload and maybe just chunk it in a simple, complex, or a sequence, in a simple sequence. And so you got to make sure that they've got phonemic awareness before they get to fluency, right? You can't skip steps. And so that's what I was thinking when I think about a reading example, is all that. Can we reduce some of that cognitive overload by our systematic approach and by sequencing skills in a proper manner? So go ahead, Dion. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, that's fine. No, thank you, Mr. May. So those are just things. So when we're thinking about that methodology, that's what we're talking about, how we do the teaching. So, right, because that's what it's special, and it's the instruction. So there's lots of different strategies we can use, and that IEP handbook has those defined, and you can go in there and look at what those different strategies are. But it may be that we just take small pieces of information, but also that modeling, so multisensory. And so what we know, good teaching is good teaching, and these are good teaching practices. But again, we're going to extend those to how often we do that, the frequency of that, the pacing of that models, or those the use of those multisensory tools. Give them a little bit of practice, let them work on independent, or use that explicit instruction, that I do, we do, you model. And that's the same thing, the way we're delivering lessons. And we know
Anita Archer talks about providing examples and non-examples. When we're doing new concepts, it's so important in that we do it stage, that we provide those rich examples and those non-examples, so students can see the relevance to this, and they can attach it to something in their lives, and we can model that for them, but then we can gradually release and start to let them work with us on that, and then eventually get to independence. And that's the goal of specially designed instruction.
Thank you, Mr. May. And so those are just some things, just some thinking points for us for thinking about how we support teachers in that specially designed instruction across that content methodology and the delivery. Because we live in a region where vocabulary is an issue. Like, we have a lot of students that come to us who have a limited vocabulary. So it may be that what we do special is that pre-teaching some vocabulary so that they have some context to help aid in understanding and comprehending. Or we're very explicit, or we just take little chunks at a time, and we support their learning that way. So again, that's what we're talking about with specially designed instruction. And so we'll take a look at the next slide here. And this is, these are just some slides, and I'm just going to take a second on that because I want to be cognizant of your time. But, this is what the teacher does. We do explicit and direct instruction. We provide lots of tools and visual supports. We model, we use manipulatives, we do a lot of positive reinforcement and feedback. And then in specially designed instruction, what the students get, they have an idea or a roadmap. We give them opportunity, we model it, and then we let them practice. We give them tools, we give them pictures, we give them things that they can hold or touch, or kinesthetic things to do. And then we're always reinforcing them and giving them feedback to help them be independent. And again, that's our goal.
And when we do that, Ms. Bates, we're promoting engagement. You know, getting a high level of response from your students and getting lots of practice turns of feedback and having them engaged in those small groups are so important. And then checking for that understanding often is so vital.
Okay. Here was just for us a practice or an example. Here might be a goal that we would have on an IEP, right? So we've thought about, we've looked at the assessment data, we've looked at their formal evaluations, their psychological, their cognitive, their adaptive scores. So we've thought about all of those things. We have a goal. We're thinking about what that student needs to work on, and we just use this one as an example. If a student after reading a third grade level passage, Doug would answer an inferential question about the passage with 80% accuracy, and we're giving them 4 or 5 trials, and each week we're going to give them a reading probe. And what we want to know is, can Doug answer? Can he infer and answer questions about that? And so we're teaching him that skill to infer, right? So we're teaching him because we want him to be able to comprehend. So we know that that is an area of need for Doug, that he has trouble comprehending text, and it's below grade level. So when we start thinking about accommodation for him, we might give him a reader, we might give him the audio text, we might give him a human reader. And so that gives him access to that grade level standard. But when we teach him, that's going to look real different, right? It's going to be much more about, because we're teaching him the skill, because remember, we're going to teach Doug to infer. So that's important. So you'll see the specially designed instruction might be a very explicit instruction on reciprocal teaching. And I'm just going to click this one so you can see an example of what we're talking about with that. Let's say we're using this strategy for teaching inferencing. And the first thing I might teach is how to predict, right? I might teach him how to make predictions. So we're doing story predictions. Maybe I draw a visual of that, right? Maybe the student can't, maybe is not able to write all of those things, but maybe they could start with drawing images of what they think is going to happen, or they say it orally, they do story predictions, right? Because I'm teaching him that skill. I'm going to teach him how to infer. So I've got to back up. I'm also going to teach him things about answering questions as you go. So if I'm thinking about text, I'm always going to say, what's the answer to this question I see right here? What do I do to read between the lines if I'm trying to learn to infer? What are some questions I have to be thinking about, right? It's that metacognitive processes. Again, that makes that teaching and learning much deeper and richer, because we're learning to think about, how do I read between the lines, right? I may do a little activity of reading between the lines. I always use the example of, you have a kid and there's the sun and he's holding an ice cream and his ice cream's dripping on the ground. What would a child infer? It's very hot, the temperature is, right? So we might use visual images to help teach those. But we're teaching them to read between the lines. So our instruction doesn't stop with giving him just a reader. Again, we're teaching him a skill. We're teaching him how to infer. So we're building them with the skills. And again, they might not go as fast as the other students. You may have to break it down and only do story predictions until they master that, and let them practice and get feedback, and practice and get feedback. Because what we want them to be able to do is use the skill across multiple areas, right? We want them to learn to do that when they're reading something about a battle in the social studies, or a conflict, a major conflict. What do they infer about that? So we're teaching the skill. So that teaching continues to happen, even though he gets a reader, or he can have that online, or he can listen to the story. We don't stop that teaching. And I think sometimes that's where there's a little bit of a gap, and that's what that's really our purpose for this session and for sessions to follow about that SDI. The other thing is, we teach kids that metacognition, thinking about it. What word did I didn't know in here? What is the author trying to tell me about this story? And I teach them to ask that. And I may teach using an organizer that says who, what, when, where, and why, right? And I teach them how to answer questions in a text using that. I'm giving them that special instruction. I'm teaching them how to answer those questions on their own. I'm giving them a skill or a strategy, or I'm giving them an organizer, but then I'm teaching them to make their own when they encounter a new text to help them be able to understand it.
You know,
And so,
Dion, when you talk about students, what's important in the learning. Good teaching is good teaching. And so we want to say really quickly, practice turns and feedback helps to make the learning permanent. The more practice turns and feedback you can get, the more intentional, immediate feedback, and that engagement with those teachers really is what makes the difference to make that learning and lead that student to more independent.
thank you, Mr. May. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And that's right. I mean, that's what we're trying to do, right? That's the whole purpose of it. So yeah, just reframing and thinking about it through that lens helps us to think about what we do for our students. And there's the questions for guiding questions for specially designed instruction. But these are good starters. You could use these as you facilitated a PLC meeting. If you're working with new teachers, you're doing a special ed, if you're having a staff meeting with your special ed team and that focuses on SDI, you could use that in your new teacher cadre. We just want to make those things available to you to use as you lead and facilitate that work in special education at your school. And if you're new at planning and developing lessons, this is a good way to just see, are you answering some of those questions? Are you answering questions about, you have to really intentionally think about what my IEP objectives, if I'm a special education teacher and I'm designing a lesson, or if I'm co-teaching a lesson, what is it that I'm addressing? What needs do my students have? What IEP goal am I working on, or what do they need support on, or short-term objective? And then how am I meeting that need in that lesson?
I was going to say, Dion, too, when you look at these planning stages, there's a little checklist back there in our guided notes that supports the Anita Archer model. And it really actually come from Marilyn Friend's book on co-teaching. And so it kind of recaptures some of these things that we do in planning. And one of the things I wanted to note was Archer's very, very explicit about that when you have lessons designed, you have those little mini lessons, and you've chunked that content, you've pulled out the relevant information, you've provided practice, you've given feedback, you've done a perky pace, you've walked around, looked around, and talked around, you've done all those things. But then clearly, when you have your hook up front in your lesson, that bell ringer or whatever you want to call it, you should be checking for prior understanding to see if that student is ready to move on to that new concept. Then you model that new concept. And one of the things that she says about when you do that hook, you should be taking a little data. You should be formatively assessing, taking a little data and seeing where the student is. Are they ready up there? You can see in that lesson opening, are they ready for this instruction? And when you build that hook in, you build in some mastery. Okay, you build in some mastery, and you provide the students with opportunities to show what they know from the previous lesson, but then you extend it to the next lesson. And one of the keys for any adult or any student is to have some success. So you got to be mindful of providing their students. Don't beat them down with this is your need and this is what you're doing wrong and that type of thing, but building that success so they're fully engaged with you. When you have early success on things, you're going to get fully engaged. And then you just do that practice, you do that feedback, and you guide the students. And then when you get to the lesson closing, and Archer says this is the one we never get to in lessons. We never get to the review. We have to review with our students and give them feedback. And when we review, we have to check for understanding, and we work data in there as well. So I just wanted to share that with you. I love this. I use this probably as much as any in pre-service with our teachers that we're working with in pre-service organizations. And then also I use it with our new teacher cadres and our emerging teachers to show them, hey, this is just a simple I do it, we do it, you do it lesson plan that you can use around anything you're doing with new concepts for students. And you can tie it back to the standard, and you can build in assessment, and you can do progress monitoring from it. And that goes back to, is it intentional? Is it special? Are we taking data from it? Is it something that's going to lead the students to independence? Those are the biggies when we're talking about specially designed instruction.
Thank you, Mr. May. I appreciate you taking some time to discuss that. So I think that's a very helpful tool for them to have that checklist, and they can share that with teachers. They're welcome to use any resource that you all are all welcome to use any resource that we have.
So a good recap might be just to say, hey, make sure our staffs know the difference between accommodation, modification, specially designed instructions, supplementary aids and services. And we're going to try to keep in good with Anita Archer and get to a review here a little bit. So as we're thinking about what we covered today, can we think intentionally about what are our next steps? How would this tell us how we can make this better? We really value you guys, and we really want to support you in your districts.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us.